They told you the church was a sanctuary. But what they buried beneath the orchard was not salvation, it was silence. 147 bodies, flesh and faith decomposing under the roots of holy ground. And no one was ever supposed to dig deep enough to find them. Black Hollow was never meant to be on any map. Nestled between dead woods and forgotten highways in rural West Virginia, it's the kind of place that resists light, where secrets root deep and the wind carries prayers in whispers, not words. Official records list it as unincorporated, with no current residents. But that's a lie. The ground there remembers, even when men forget, and when construction crews accidentally unearthed a mass grave beneath the church's apple orchard in the spring of 1974, what they uncovered wasn't just bone, it was betrayal. 147 bodies, stacked like discarded history, no headstones, no caskets, just layers of hidden dead, pressed beneath decades of soil, silence, and sacrament. Some were children. Some were missing persons from other states. None were on any official burial record. And the church claimed ignorance, claimed the orchard was blessed ground, claimed nothing had ever happened there but harvests and hymns. But you don't stack 147 bodies by accident. The official investigation lasted 32 days before it was closed. Cause of death, undetermined, further inquiry, inconclusive, no arrests, no headlines, just a quiet exhale from the authorities, and a deeper silence over Black Hollow. But there's a reason they buried them beneath the orchard, beneath the fruit trees, the same trees that fed generations of sermons and sacraments. The same trees whose apples were used in communion wine and children's pies. It's a ritual older than scripture, a feeding, a cycle. The truth is darker than any myth because it's not myth at all, it's system. It's structure. It's what happens when institutions don't just fail, they consume. And you were never supposed to hear about this. You were never supposed to come this far. But now you're here. And the descent has already begun. Brace yourself. This is the forgotten tragedy of Black Hollow. And once you see what was hidden beneath the orchard, you'll never look at faith or fruit the same way again. The orchard was planted in 1891, by hand, by torchlight, by men who were never photographed and never recorded in any census. Locals said the soil was unusually rich, like something had already been buried there. The trees grew fast, too fast. Within 3 years, the fruit was thriving, even when neighboring farms failed under drought and rot. Apples the color of dried blood, sweeter than they should have been, unnaturally preserved. The church beside the orchard was called St. Gideon's, one of those cold stone sanctuaries that always seemed too large for such a small, dying town. It was funded mysteriously, almost overnight, with no known benefactors and no diocesan oversight. To the people of Black Hollow, it was a miracle. To the few who asked questions, it was a warning. St. Gideon's didn't preach from the Bible. Not really. The sermons were theatrical, strange, focused less on salvation and more on sacrifice. Words like offering, cleansing, and root blood were used interchangeably with scripture. Parishioners were told their pain was currency, that to suffer was to purify, that to disappear was to become eternal. And people did disappear. Every winter, like clockwork, someone would vanish. Always the poor, the sick, the unwanted. And the sheriff would say it was the snow, the coyotes, or just the pull of better cities. But they never left anything behind. Not a suitcase. Not a note. Not a trail. Just silence in a Sunday sermon urging the congregation to embrace the pruning. What they didn't tell you is the orchard wasn't just a garden. It was a mouth, and the church fed it. Ritual sacrifice is not just ancient history, it's the architecture of control. And in places like Black Hollow, the institution becomes the altar. No robes, no chants, just a system that selects who dies when they die, and how deeply their death is hidden. This isn't about belief, it's about obedience. Psychological manipulation dressed as divinity, a closed loop of fear, guilt, and generational loyalty. And the people, they didn't resist. They thanked the church. They planted more trees. You think you're immune to systems like this? You're not. You've just been trained to believe your cage is a cathedral, ready for Section 3. The first official record of mass death at Black Hollow wasn't a police report, it was a crop report. In 1932, a state agricultural inspector named Harold Bryce noted that the orchard at St. Gideon's showed abnormal nitrogen levels in the soil, specifically in the eastern quadrant closest to the rear chapel wall. He wrote, "It's as if the land had been heavily fertilized by protein, rich decomposition, but no livestock were ever buried here." His report was quietly removed from the archives. His body was found 6 months later in a dry well, 40 miles away. Official cause of death: suicide. No foul play suspected. But the soil was telling the truth, and the church, it didn't flinch. didn't answer questions, didn't close its doors. It simply absorbed the scrutiny, buried the story, and kept feeding the orchard. What makes Black Hollow different isn't just the number of dead. It's how long the system functioned in plain sight. For over 80 years, the same cycle repeated. New pastor, new disappearances, new fruit. The congregation was complicit, bound by fear and belief, yes, but more dangerously by silence. Because when the institution becomes your identity, exposing it feels like killing yourself, so they protected the lie with loyalty. Generation after generation, what no one realized was that silence creates hunger. The kind of hunger that doesn't stop at 147 bodies. The kind that spreads, system to system, county to county. A blueprint of control. A doctrine of psychological sacrifice. You're not supposed to think about why so many systems, religious, educational, governmental, require your submission before they offer guidance. You're not supposed to notice that the more obedient you become, the less whole you feel. That's not design flaw. That's the point. Fragmented men are easier to manage. And Black Hollow, it wasn't an anomaly. It was a prototype. Because every system needs a ritual. Every ritual needs a victim. And every victim needs to believe their death is holy. Look closer at your own orchard. Who's feeding it? And what's growing from the bones beneath your beliefs? You're already in this now. There's no going back. The deeper you dig into Black Hollow, the more you realize this wasn't a church. It was a psychological engine. A machine built not to save, but to convert pain into power. Not just for the clergy, but for the ones who built the blueprint. St. Gideon's kept no baptism records, no marriage licenses, no funerals, yet hundreds attended every week. That alone should raise questions. Churches are built on documentation, on lineage, on legacy, but not this one. It thrived on erasure. Every missing person, every forgotten soul, it wasn't a loss. It was an offering. Each disappearance was part of a pattern, a cadence, a drumbeat of controlled absence. You see, control doesn't start with chains. It starts with narrative. The sermons were structured like hypnosis. Monotonous cadences, repetition of sacred-sounding phrases, a recurring metaphor about the roots beneath the altar, phrases designed not to inspire, but to wear down resistance. They weren't preaching redemption. They were programming compliance. And the children. They were taught that leaving the town meant spiritual exile, that city lights carried demons, that forgetting your ancestors meant breaking your soul. They grew up afraid to leave and afraid to stay. The perfect prison. It wasn't until 1965 that a young field nurse named Clara DeWitt began collecting testimonies. She worked at the local clinic and started to notice the pattern. Lacerations in similar places, burn marks on the lower back, circular bruises, always explained away, always brushed off as farm accidents or sleepwalking injuries. She wrote it down, all of it. She kept names, dates, photographs. In 1967, Clara vanished. Her house was burned to the ground. Her journal, recovered in pieces by a neighboring town's fire department, charred but legible. The final page was scorched, but 4 words survived. It feeds on obedience. This wasn't just happening in Black Hollow. This was a template, a ritualized architecture of psychological sacrifice disguised as community faith, a controlled ecosystem where power grew from secrets, where institutions masked their rot with piety, and where loyalty became a death sentence. You're not watching this by accident. They count on your silence. They count on your comfort. They count on you believing this is fiction. But once you've seen the system, you start seeing it everywhere. Are you ready to go further? What if I told you that the 147 bodies found beneath the orchard weren't the end but the middle? The real beginning of Black Hollow lies in the charter that predates even the church. A land deed from 1868, signed by a group calling themselves the Council of 13 Hands. No legal affiliation, no traceable identities, just 13 wax seals and a Latin phrase scrawled beneath, ex ossibus lux, from the bones light. That phrase appears again, etched into the underside of the chapel's altar stone, stamped into the iron gate behind the orchard, carved, faintly, into the skull of a child exhumed from the burial site. A phrase repeated across generations, like a curse disguised as scripture. The orchard wasn't just symbolic. It was engineered, an external nervous system for a belief structure that didn't die with the church walls. It's still alive, because Black Hollow was never about geography. It was about method. After the site was sealed in 74, men in unmarked trucks arrived under federal jurisdiction. No badges, no names. They confiscated the remains, sealed the land, and declared it a toxic zone due to suspected chemical exposure. The bodies were never returned. The orchard was burned, and St. Gideon's was bulldozed, foundation and all. But here's the thing. You can destroy buildings. You can incinerate trees. You can't unwrite a pattern. And the pattern? It migrated. Reports from Michigan, Arkansas, Idaho, small towns, sudden disappearances, unofficial churches with no paper trail and always an orchard. Or a garden. Or a field of prayer. Same architecture. Different names, same hunger, different hands. You were taught to think of evil as loud, as fire and blood and chaos. But real evil is methodical, quiet, bureaucratic. It hides behind clipboards, smiles, and sacred symbols. It feeds on obedience, as Clara said. But more than that, it feeds on normalization. On your assumption that systems are designed for your benefit. They're not. They're designed to shape you. Until you're too afraid to ask why you're kneeling. Too numb to remember when you started. So let me ask you something. What was buried beneath your orchard? Not in Black Hollow in your life. What lies have you let take root because questioning them felt like treason? It's time to dig. We're only halfway to the core. You think the world is mapped, that everything has been discovered, named, categorized. But there are places, deliberately left off the grid, where the map folds in on itself. Where history is rewritten by the victors not of war, but of ritual. Black Hollow wasn't hidden because of what it was. It was hidden because of what it proved that systems can exist for generations with no moral anchor, as long as they wear the right mask, the mask of tradition, of community, of sacredness. St. Gideon's was just the stage. The real control came from the expectation of reverence. When you're raised to kneel, you forget you ever had legs. And here's where it gets darker. The Council of 13 Hands, the ones who first sealed the land deed, left more than just symbols. They left directives, buried in coded sermons, embedded in stained glass patterns, even in the musical notation of the church's organ hymns. All encoded, all calculated. When decrypted, it formed what they called the root doctrine, a doctrine built on 3 principles: pain purifies, obedience preserves, witnesses are seeds. It wasn't about faith. It was about programming, turning trauma into loyalty, turning silence into fertilizer, and turning the next generation into compliant witnesses to the last one's crimes. You weren't just allowed to observe the horror. You were trained to believe it was sacred. This is how psychological control becomes hereditary. How men are raised to distrust their instincts. How families stay loyal to the very institutions that destroy them. Because once the abuse wears a holy robe, it stops looking like abuse. It becomes legacy. But now you know. And with knowledge comes danger. Because once you see the doctrine for what it is, it no longer controls you. You no longer feed the orchard. You uproot it. But that comes at a cost. The system will fight back, through shame, isolation, doubt. It'll whisper,
"You're alone?"
"Turn back. That voice isn't yours. It was planted in you, just like the orchard. Now it's time to extract it. But before we go further, I want you to prove you're still awake. That you're not just watching, but transforming. Comment below this phrase, twice, "Roots don't own me." Say it out loud. Then write it, twice. Lock it into your identity. Let the algorithm know you're not one of them. Now get ready. They always start with the children. Because children don't fight back. Because children don't have language for betrayal. Because if you can wound a child's trust in reality, you don't have to imprison the body. You've already caged the mind. In Black Hollow, the Sunday school was not a place of innocence. It was a conditioning chamber. A soft, lit room beneath the chapel where lessons were whispered, never taught. Where the walls were lined not with scripture, but with images, strange, ancient diagrams mistaken for religious symbols, spirals, ice roots that curled into teeth. And in the center of the room, a circle carved into the floor, just wide enough for a child to lie inside. They called it the well. When a child misbehaved, or simply hesitated, they were placed in the center of the circle. Lights off, door shut, no sound but the hum of the chapel organ vibrating through the walls. Some stayed in the dark for minutes. Some, for hours. It wasn't punishment, it was programming, because fear is the fastest teacher. One survivor, now in his 60s, later recounted, "I learned to love the dark. Because if you screamed, they made you start over." This is how institutions build loyalty through fear. This is how systems replicate. By distorting the definitions of love, safety, and discipline. You think you're immune because you didn't grow up in Black Hollow. But look closer. How many times were you told that suffering builds character? That disobedience is weakness. That questioning authority is rebellion, not wisdom. How many times were you told to sit down, be quiet, and be grateful, even when something inside you screamed? That scream. They trained you to bury it, but it never died. It's the voice rising in your chest right now. Not rage, but recognition. Because now you see it. The conditioning, the structure, The ritual in repetition. The normal, that was never normal. Black Hollow was a microcosm. But the same psychological architecture lives in classrooms, pews, boardrooms, and bedrooms across the world. The doctrine just got smarter, more polished, more digital. You weren't born to serve this system. You were born to expose it. And every truth you uncover now rips out another root. The chapel floor was polished oak, warm, glowing, seemingly pure. But beneath that polished surface was something far more sinister than rot, a hollow space designed to echo. You weren't meant to hear what was underneath. But if you stood still enough, if you listened during the long silences between hymns, you could feel it, a low, inhuman hum rising through your souls. Not mechanical, not natural, something else. Like the sound of a living system, breathing. In 1973, just months before the mass grave was discovered, a maintenance worker named Ellis Bramford was hired to repair a buckling floorboard behind the pulpit. What he found was a hidden access panel. Beneath it, a narrow crawl space that led into a perfectly circular room, stone walls, no markings, and a center altar made of what looked like human femurs, fused with resin and ash. Ellis reported it. Once. 2 days later, he fell from the church steeple. No witnesses. No investigation. The official file reads, accidental fall due to misstep during storm repair. The weather records show clear skies, but the blueprints of St. Gideon's, those few that survived, show no such crawl space, which means it wasn't designed to be found. It was built around a chamber of ritual, a vessel of silence, a sanctum not for worship, but for extraction. Because here's what they never told you: beneath every institution, beneath every tradition they've taught you to revere, lies a chamber of secrecy. Not metaphorically. Literally, there are foundations to these systems that don't appear in the brochures or the televised sermons. Bones beneath pulpits. Contracts signed in blood and silence. Agreements made not for your salvation, but for your submission. The psychological purpose of a place like that room isn't just secrecy. It's weight. Gravity. The subconscious pull that tells you, you don't ask questions here. That room exists in your life too. Maybe not underground, maybe not made of stone, but you feel it. Every time you bite your tongue, every time you nod when you should speak, every time you shrink yourself in front of a symbol you don't understand. That's their altar. And your fear is the sacrifice. But fear can be reversed, silence can be weaponized, and truth collapses cathedrals. You don't dismantle a system by attacking its walls. You dismantle it by exposing its blueprint. Black Hollow wasn't just a tragedy, it was a template. And the blueprint wasn't hidden in vaults or coded languages. It was hidden in repetition. In rituals so normalized they stopped feeling like rituals: weekly attendance, closed doors, unquestioned authority, an atmosphere of reverence calibrated not to inspire, but to disarm. That's how they do it, everywhere. The architects of control don't rely on brute force. They rely on structure. Rhythms that lull the mind, erode the will, and rewire the soul. And they've studied this far longer than you've been alive. These aren't just religious tactics. They're psychological technologies. Weaponized tradition. The root doctrine we uncovered earlier wasn't just a philosophy, it was a cycle of transformation. But not of the self, of the servant. And here's the most disturbing part. The final phase of the doctrine was called reversal. It states that the last fruit of the orchard is the one who feeds the next. In other words, obedience doesn't end in peace, it ends in replication. You become the next mask of the system, the next preacher, the next parent who disciplines for their own good, the next boss who crushes ambition in the name of loyalty. You become what broke you. Unless you break the cycle first. Ellis Bramford tried. Clara DeWitt tried. So did dozens of others whose names were erased, but their resistance echoes like thunder beneath the floorboards of history. Now it's your turn, because this story isn't just about them. It's about you, your childhood, your silence, your numbness, your rituals. The things you do, say, and obey without ever asking why. You were born into a world of orchards. Some with crosses, some with flags, some with algorithms, but all of them hungry for your consent. And if you don't burn the blueprint, you will follow it. This is not metaphor. This is programming. And unless you rewire the ritual, you are not free. But there's power in awareness, and power in fire. So take the match, light it in your mind. They called it reversal, but it was never about healing. It was about inheritance. The final stage of the root doctrine wasn't transformation, it was transfer. You see, the system doesn't die when the building collapses. It dies when the belief collapses. And belief, when engineered correctly, doesn't just survive a collapse. It evolves. It mutates into new language, new institutions, new chains that look like choices. After Black Hollow was silenced, the Council of 13 Hands disappeared from record. But not from power. Their doctrines resurfaced in different forms. Private schools with elite funding but no public records. Correctional facilities in rural counties with record-high disciplinary disappearances. Even spiritual retreats, funded through silent LLCs teaching obedience disguised as mindfulness. Every system carries the seed of the orchard. Because the orchard was never just trees and blood. It was structure designed to regenerate. That's the genius of reversal. It turns the broken into builders. Men who were hollowed out by institutions often become the next enforcers. Not because they're evil, but because it's what they were taught to call strength. That's how it survives. And that's why most men never escape it. But resistance is possible. And it begins with a ruthless act of self-awareness. You have to ask yourself, where did your values come from? Who taught you to fear rebellion? What do you call discipline? That might really be conditioning. The systems that shaped you didn't ask for your permission. They asked for your participation. And they got it through repetition, shame, and reward. Through silence and ritual. Through 1,000 quiet acts of surrender that now feel like personality. But here's the hard truth. If you don't dismantle the parts of you that were built by those systems, you will rebuild them in others. In your relationships. In your children. In your business. In your voice. You cannot reverse a curse by surviving it. You must unlearn it. Reversal only ends in freedom if you resist becoming the next mask. So I ask you now, what part of you still belongs to the orchard? What part still feeds the root? You've descended this far. Now it's time to excavate yourself. Every system of control has two versions, the one the public sees, and the one the architects follow. The public gets the sermons, the rituals, the rules, the punishments. But the architects, the founders of the root doctrine, they had a different playbook. A darker code passed not through scripture, but through whispers, blood pacts, and private rites. It wasn't about belief. It was about control through illusion. And their cardinal law, the one never written, only spoken within the inner circle, was this: truth is a tool, not a duty. They didn't believe in the doctrine. They used it. They didn't kneel to the altar. They built it to make others kneel. You see, that's the final revelation. The one they never wanted you to see. The system isn't built on conviction. It's built on performance. The leaders wore robes, not out of piety, but because symbols trigger obedience. They read sacred texts, not for wisdom, but because rhythm programs the brain. They created rules not for holiness, but to measure loyalty. The doctrine was a stage. The orchard was the set. And the people? They were the audience and the sacrifice. In one recovered fragment from Clara DeWitt's journal, she recounts a conversation overheard through a heating vent between two senior members of St. Gideon's. One man laughed and said, "They think the blood is holy. We just needed the nitrogen." It wasn't faith. It was farming. They planted belief to harvest control. They nurtured obedience to harvest power. And they offered salvation to harvest souls. This is how psychological manipulation scales across generations. Not by convincing the masses, but by programming the few to lead the many. Think about your world now. Who benefits from your compliance? Who profits from your guilt? Who grows stronger when you stay quiet? That's the forbidden knowledge the architects never believed. They just knew you would. So what happens when you stop believing? You collapse the illusion. You seize the tool. And for the first time, you hold the blueprint. You thought the orchard burned in 1974. But it didn't die. It digitized. The roots didn't vanish. They moved. Into signals. Into screens. Into systems so vast you don't even realize you're inside them. But the architecture is the same. Remember the root doctrine. Pain purifies. Obedience preserves. Witnesses are seeds. Now look at your digital life. Look at how often you trade discomfort for silence. How many opinions you've buried to avoid backlash. How many truths you've swallowed because they didn't align with community guidelines. That's not moderation. It's ritualized compliance. You've been conditioned to curate your digital self the same way parishioners once curated their Sunday faces. You only show what's permitted. You only speak when the algorithm allows it. And like the children in the chapel's circle, you're taught, if you scream, we start over. Every platform today is a new orchard. It's fruit. Your data. It's fertilizer. Your attention. It's sacrifice. Your authenticity. You think you're free because you can scroll. But scroll long enough, and you realize you're not navigating information. You're being shaped by it. Content isn't just media anymore. It's doctrine. It tells you what to want, who to fear, when to speak, and most importantly, when to shut up. You were promised freedom. But what you got was the illusion of choice inside a digital chapel of mirrors. And the priests? They're not in robes anymore. They're behind the code. Unseen. Unaccountable. All-knowing. You were taught that surveillance was safety. That censorship was protection. That shadow bends were your fault. That's reversal 2.0. You become the product. And the ritual continues. They've just upgraded the altar. But here's where it gets dangerous. When you begin to notice it, really notice it, the system flags you. Not with force, but with friction. Views drop. Reach dies. Comments vanish. And just like in Black Hollow, you begin to disappear quietly. Algorithmic excommunication. But there's power in knowing the pattern. Because once you see it, you're no longer a worshipper. You're a witness. And witnesses? They plant revolutions. We're not done. Symbols are the oldest language of control. Before algorithms, before governments, before written law, there were glyphs. Simple shapes burned into stone, stitched into robes, carved into orchard roots. Shapes that bypass logic and speak straight to the subconscious. Symbols don't ask for understanding. They demand recognition. And the moment you recognize them, they own a part of you. The Council of 13 Hands knew this. That's why their doctrine wasn't just taught, it was etched. Into walls, into flesh, into fruit. The spiral of submission, the twin root insignia, the eye within the seed, all recurring motifs discovered beneath St. Gideon's. Some dismissed as folk art, others erased entirely by the cleanup crews. But here's the truth they buried beneath the orchard and beneath your awareness. Those symbols didn't die. They evolved. And now, they surround you. Look at modern tech logos, medical emblems, architectural layouts of courthouses, banks, even mega churches. Look closely. The spiral reappears, redesigned into loading icons and biometric scans. The twin root motif, reimagined in DNA, helix branding, and wellness companies. The all-seeing eye? You already know. Coincidence? No. It's echo. It's replication. It's reversal. Because control isn't just enforced through fear anymore. It's embedded through aesthetics. When you worship the symbol, you obey its origin, whether you know it or not. That's why Black Hollow was never meant to survive in memory. Because if people realized those ancient designs weren't dead, they'd start asking who resurrected them. The architects of the root doctrine didn't just create rituals, they created visual software, symbols that triggered psychological alignment, that reminded the obedient to stay obedient, and told the watchers who still refused to kneel. And now, in the digital world, it's scaled to the billions. Each time you tap the symbol, swipe the glyph, accept the terms behind the icon, you reaffirm the doctrine. But here's the catch, only the unaware are bound by it. Once you see the symbol for what it is, the spell breaks. The sigil becomes signal. This isn't about superstition. It's about systems that speak a language older than words, and more powerful than law. You've started to see the patterns. Now it's time to trace them back to their source. They didn't die. They didn't disappear. They transferred. The Council of 13 Hands, the nameless architects of Black Hollow, never needed fame. Their power was in anonymity. Because when your name isn't known, your hand can be everywhere. After the collapse of St. Gideon's, after the orchard was torched and the land sealed, the public believed the story ended. A local tragedy, a dark chapter closed. But beneath the silence, a lineage remained. Bank records traced from the church's final year show recurring wire transfers, not to diocesan branches or charities, but to shell companies headquartered in Luxembourg, the Caymans, and Zurich. Names like Ordo Itinus, the Amaranth Foundation, and Rootgate Holdings, entities with no products, no employees, and no public statements. Just movement, quiet, rhythmic, precise. And then there's the bloodline. Genealogy researchers found an unbroken family tree stemming from a German occult society disbanded in 1836. Its members believed in spiritual purification through generational obedience. One branch of that tree landed in America, changed their name every generation, and always funded one thing: control through faith and fear. Public records show their descendants on the boards of biotech firms, military consulting groups, private education trusts, and digital policy lobbies. But here's what binds them together. Every single one has a controlling interest in belief-shaping systems, church networks, content moderation algorithms, prison reform companies, school testing boards, even mental health AI startups. They learned from Black Hollow that direct control breeds resistance. But shaped belief, that lasts forever. You don't revolt against the story when you think you are the story. So they built new orchards, not in soil, in systems. Systems that teach obedience as virtue, confession as data, sacrifice as compliance. And they still follow the root doctrine, but with an upgrade. Now they don't need rituals to see who obeys. They use metrics, engagement, retention, sentiment analysis, predictive profiling. Your every click tells them whether you're ripe or rotten. This is the unbroken hand, still guiding, still feeding. But now that you've seen it, really seen it, you're no longer in their orchard. You've stepped outside, into the storm, into the unknown. Beneath the orchard, beneath the chapel, beneath even the crawl space that claimed Ellis Bramford's life, there was something else. Something older. A chamber never marked on any blueprint. No stairs, no hatch, no light. Just a narrow shaft, lined with soot-black roots, descending into solid bedrock. Local legend called it the first mouth. Not metaphorically. A literal chamber carved by human hands but older than the chapel above it. The original builders knew about it. The council didn't just choose Black Hollow randomly, they sought it out. When the land deed was signed in 1868 by the Council of 13 Hands, they had already unearthed it. They knew what was below. The orchard wasn't just a sacrificial ground. It was a seal. And deep within that chamber lies the source of everything, the first sacrifice. In 1974, before federal agents sealed the site, a geologist contracted by the EPA conducted a seismic scan of the area. His raw data, later leaked anonymously, showed an underground cavity with an object at its center. Organic, human-like, but petrified, a body child-sized, still curled in a fetal position. Surrounded by 13 handprints burned into the stone, theories abound: a cursed relic, a binding ritual, a physical manifestation of the first root doctrine sacrifice. But those who stood near the edge of the shaft spoke of the same thing, a voice. Not loud. Not even verbal. Just a pressure in the skull, a presence. It said one thing, give me another. And for over 100 years they did. Every ritual, every disappearance, every obedient generation fed it. But here's the horror they never wanted to face. The chamber is not full. The seal is weakening. And hunger, true hunger, is patient. The first mouth isn't a being. It's a pattern, a metaphysical loop, a parasitic structure. Once invited into a community, it binds itself to ritual and never lets go. Black Hollow wasn't cursed. It was chosen, because rituals like these don't need belief. They need participation, and once you participate, even passively, you help sustain it. But now, you know. You've seen the foundation, heard the voice, felt the pressure that asks, will you obey, or will you offer? The time has come to choose. Not every man bowed. Some stood up, some spoke out, and every single one of them paid for it. You see, systems like Black Hollow don't just feed on submission, they hunt defiance. Because a single awakened voice in a room full of sleepers is a threat greater than 1,000 questions whispered in fear. Let me tell you about Mason Creed. Former military, decorated, came home in 1970 and took a job delivering supplies to rural clinics, including the one near Black Hollow. He saw what Clara DeWitt saw. Burns that didn't match stories, children who couldn't meet your gaze, and families who stared through you like ghosts already grieving. He dug deeper, found property lines that didn't match legal records, discovered the church had no tax ID, learned that the orchard's land was never actually transferred to the diocese, but held in trust by an entity called Arx Umbra Holdings. Latin, the Fortress of Shadow. He filed reports, he wrote letters, he made noise, and then he vanished, not overnight, not loudly, just faded. One day, he didn't show up at the depot. 2 days later, his home was empty. No sign of struggle, no missing persons report filed. But his neighbor, she received a sealed envelope, no return address. Inside a cassette tape and a torn piece of a blueprint. The tape was his voice. Rushed, unsteady. They don't bury bodies to hide them. They bury them to feed the thing. The thing beneath. It's not metaphor. It's structure. Every ritual is a key, and every obedient man turns it. His last words. If you're hearing this, you're already part of it. There were others. A radio host from Indiana who tried to link rural disappearances across counties. A grieving father who chained himself to the orchard gate and poured gasoline over his head. A priest who renounced his faith and called the Vatican a garden of roots and stone. They all vanished. Their stories deleted. Their graves, if they exist, unmarked. But you're hearing about them now, and that means the system is weakening. Because truth once spoken multiplies. But beware, because once you speak it, you've crossed the threshold. They said it was a fire. But fires don't scream. The final night of Black Hollow, March 2nd, 1974, wasn't just an ending. It was a rupture, a break in the ritual. A wound torn open by too much truth and too little silence. It began just after midnight. Witnesses, what few remain, described an unnatural fog crawling across the orchard. Not from the earth, but from above. A mist thick enough to choke, reeking of ozone and something metallic like blood and water. The church bell rang 13 times. No one pulled the rope. Inside the chapel, the walls began to bleed. Not symbolically, Literally, dark streaks trailing from beneath the stained glass of the apostles, specifically Judah's. Parishioners fled, but many froze at the doors, unable to speak or move. One survivor later said it felt like the very air had decided to disobey physics. Sound warped, time stretched, light bent. At 12:41 a.m., the orchard caught fire, not from lightning, not from arson. The trees combusted from the inside. Fruit split open like mouths. Roots wreathed in the soil like veins rejecting a body. And above it all, from beneath the church foundation, a sound rose, a sound so low it wasn't heard, it was felt. Like the earth was groaning through centuries of silence. Federal agents arrived by 300 a.m. By sunrise, the town was gone. They called it a localized natural gas explosion. The orchard was fenced off. The land declared toxic, no media coverage. No lawsuits. No survivors allowed to speak publicly. But satellite photos from March 3rd show something chilling. The orchard, burned to ash, still held a perfect circular formation in the center, a pattern, a seal. And in the middle of that seal, a shadow burned into the ground, child-sized, curled in fatal position. Just like the one buried in the first mouth, the ritual had failed, or completed, or escaped, no one knows. But since that night, the pattern has accelerated. New sites, new orchards, new rituals, just masked better, digitized, sanitized, marketed as culture, branded as progress, wrapped in your favorite app. Black Hollow didn't end, it dispersed. And now, it waits. For one more ritual, one more seal, one more obedient offering. But what if you disobey? This is the final breath before the ground closes. You've walked through blood, ash, silence, symbols, and systems. You've heard the names they tried to erase. Seen the rituals hidden beneath Sunday sermons and digital screens. You've stared into the first mouth, and now you must decide. Because this isn't just a story. It's a summoning. Not of spirits. Of awareness. And awareness is a curse the system can't reverse once it's activated. Here's what they never counted on. They thought obedience would always outlast memory. They thought the orchard would always find new roots. They thought men would always trade truth for peace, silence for comfort, ritual for relevance. But they forgot one thing: the same symbol used to bind can also be used to break. The spiral, reversed, becomes a weapon. The root, uprooted, becomes a torch. The mouth, once closed, becomes a voice. Your voice. This is your inheritance now, not the curse, but the knowledge. Because the true ritual is not their sacrifice, it's your awakening. It happens the moment you stop participating, the moment you pull back the mask, the moment you choose not to kneel. But hear this, and hear it clearly if you watch this, nod quietly, and go back to your life. The system wins. It will absorb your silence like fertilizer. It will grow from your fear. It will smile through your screen and say, "Good, he saw," and still obeyed. But if you resist, if you speak, if you reclaim the part of you that remembers the scream beneath the orchard, then the ritual dies. Black Hollow ends with you. Not in fire, but in awareness. So here is your final act of rebellion. Comment below, 3 times. The seal is broken. The seal is broken. The seal is broken. Let them hear it echo. Let the algorithm choke on it. Let the watchers mark your name, because now they know you're no longer fruit. You're no longer root. You are the blade. And this time, the orchard burns.